And these are some of the results that we came out with. Regarding the clusters, we found that there is actually one very clear cross-border cluster in the Mexico, USA, or the Chihuahua, Texas, New Mexico border around the area of Ciudad Juárez, El Paso. There is one very clear cross-border cluster there, theoretically, of course. There is another very clear cross-border cluster in the Quintana Roo, Belize border, especially in the area of Chetumal, and actually another one in the area between Guatemala and Belize, which is the number 4 you can see on the screen on your right side. That's the one near the area of Tikal, Caracol. There are no cross-border clusters in the border between Chiapas, Guatemala. All clusters in that border are within one of the borders, within one of the countries, sorry. So these are the results for the cluster analysis, and as I just said, we also attempted to do an exercise to delineate corridors in these borders. All corridors in all 3 borders were cross-border. Also the corridors in the Chiapas-Guatemala border, and we can conclude that there is a clear multi-destination potential in all borders, and especially in the Mexico-USA border and in the Chiapas-Guatemala border as well. So this was the results for the first exercise, the first article. We move now to the second article, which is Tourism Destination Zoning in Mountain Regions, a consumer-based approach. I just remind the research question again, which is to what extent are the new tourism zones more effective than administrative regions for tourism purposes? To do this exercise, what we did was to focus on a mountain range, a natural border between France and Spain in Europe. There are actually 3 countries because there's also Andorra there, and it's worth to mention that there's lots of different administrative regions within each of the countries regarding France and Spain, of course. So this, we can say this mountain is divided into a large number of different administrative regions. Following the same methodology that we used in the 3 borders in Mexico, we identified 9 tourism zones in these Pyrenees Mountains, which are the ones you can see on the screen. And just a number of conclusions or ideas that I want to mention regarding this map are the following. 9 tourism zones that differ from current tourism destinations. All of them are cross-border, either interregional or international. They are actually more uniform in size than administrative regions. They are very similar to historical regions, for instance, in the case of Andorra and Cerdanya region, or in the case of the Basque country, or even in the case of the Oriental Pyrenees, which is what we could think as of the northern Catalan country. So they are very similar to historical regions, at least some of the zones that we identified. And it is also important to mention that the right decision when we chose time distance as the relevant distance criterion in these maps. Let me just explain you one example here, which is the municipality of Vall de Boí, which is exactly this one here. As you can see, it is very close to other clusters that are very close to this municipality, but when we did the cluster analysis, it fell into another zone, which is this one. And this is because between this municipality and the neighboring municipalities, there is a high mountain peaks. So that means that linear distance in this case is not as good to be used as time distance to connect this municipality with their neighbors. That's why, in terms of time distance, this municipality is closer to this other region. By the way, it's also its historical region again. Having said all this, we moved one step forward again, and we analyzed the results, trying to see if there were a possibility of doing a correlation analysis to compare the new tourism zones with the administrative regions. what we found, we used a number of variables that you can see on the screen regarding the attractions. We analyzed intensity, specificity, and variety of attractions in these different zones and in these administrative regions. We also calculated and we used number of borders within each of the tourism zones, in this case, not in the case of administrative regions, of course, because there's no borders inside the administrative regions. And we also calculated accommodation units in each of the zones and administrative regions, and the population, again, in both. I will just show you the results, but before going to the results of that, we, at the end, again, used the cluster analysis again to classify the new tourism zones, the 9 different tourism zones, into different categories of tourism zones. We used ANOVA and ETA tests to ensure the significance of the variables in the categorization, as I will show you right away. This is the correlation table between the attributes and the tourism zones. As you can see, there is a number of correlations there, and also there, and also there, that I will just explain in this slide here. Intensity correlates with specificity, and that gives the idea that first-class attractions help in the development of second-class and other attractions. Also, the attractiveness, which is the mixture of intensity and specificity, correlates with accommodation units, giving the idea that first-class and second-class attractions also tend to help in the concentration of accommodation units nearby. And even more important for us, attractiveness correlates with the number of borders, which in fact gives the idea that the more borders you have in one zone, the more attractive it is, which makes probably a lot of sense if we think under the perspective of tourists' behavior. So we can conclude after this correlation analysis that our tourism zones are more effective than administrative regions, at least in our case. And as I said, what we did later on was to cluster again these 9 zones into categories of zones. This is the table that came out of this cluster analysis. There is a number of tourism zones in each of the categories of zones, and maybe better than this, you can see this map to understand what was the result. There is one tourism zone in the category 1. There is 2 different tourism zones in the second category, again 2 different zones in the third category, and 4 different zones in the last category. The first category, which is number 1, is the area of Andorra and Cerdanya. The second category of zones are the zones in the Basque Country and the Oriental Pyrenees, and the third categories of zones are the ones in the Atlantic Pyrenees and the Aragon Pyrenees, and the rest are the fourth category. Maybe it is a little better to explain it with this slide here. Type 1, which is, as I said, Andorra and Cerdanya region, is the most highly cross-border. It has the highest levels on intensity, specificity, and variety of attractions, and also in terms of the accommodation units. Type 2 category of zones, which had the zones of the Oriental Pyrenees and the Basque Country, is the most populated, probably because it's nearer the sea, and these are more populated zones. It has highest values in variety and medium values in the rest of the attributes that we used, like intensity, specificity, and accommodation units, and cross-border nature. Type 3 category has medium levels on all the variables, and type 4 has the lowest levels in all the indicators. And so, once we have identified a number of tourism zones with potential for cross-border development, we were very interested in knowing what was the process that helped or dificulted to the emergence of these cross-border destinations, and specifically, what was the processes that led to a governance in these cross-border destinations. We focused to do this in the Cerdanya Valley Catalan-Pyrenees cross-border region. This is a valley in the Pyrenees that is divided by several borders, as you can see in this map. For instance, it's divided between Spain and France, but within Spain, it's again divided in two different provinces. Within France, it's divided into different regions as well, all of them belonging to the Oriental Pyrenees, but still, and it's also worth to mention the Spanish enclave of Libya inside the French border as a reminder of the negotiation processes that led to the delineation of the border as we know it today after the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659, which I will not get in because I understand we don't have a lot of time for that, but just to mention that there's lots of borders in this cross-border valley. So we focused also in this area because we were aware of the potential for the development of the whole valley as one destination, and we indeed knew also that there were some slight or first attempts to go in this direction. For instance, a few years ago, the Spanish Cerdaña had issued a map, a tourism map that was a cross-border map. It was one of the first examples, and that's why we approached to this area to analyze indeed what was going on. The methods to do this were different than the ones you have just seen until the moment. For the collection of data, we used semi-structured interviews, a number of 13 interviews, 7 in the Spanish side and 6 in the French side, and they included all categories of stakeholders, both public and private, and from both sides of the border. For the analysis, we used a narrative analysis and a thematic analysis. The intention was to construct the story behind the creation of the cross-border destination from a multi-stakeholder approach. We tried to build up the story from the different stories of the different persons we interviewed. Then we used a thematic analysis to classify all the information. We came out with a large number of issues that we wanted to include, and then we aggregated the number of issues into 5 different categories or factors that help or difficult the development of a cross-border destination in this area. The 5 factors that we identified are the ones you can see on the screen right now, which are cross-border institutional dissimilarity and similarity, the role of bridging actors and institutions, leadership and financing, types of relationships, and finally, serendipity.